The dust of the West carries more than just dirt and grit. It carries secrets. It settles on broken dreams and forgotten promises. For one woman, arriving in a town built on hope, the dust tasted of bitter rejection. Stranded with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a future as empty as the prairie horizon, she thought she had reached the end of her line. But on those cold steel tracks, a small lost voice was about to ask a question that would rewrite her destiny, unearthing a conspiracy of greed and murder that a whole town was trying to bury. The whistle of the Union Pacific locomotive was a mournful cry that echoed Evelyn Reed's own heart. It was the sound of arrival, and for her, the sound of immediate departure. The train, a great black beast panting steam, had dutifully carried her across 1,000 miles of unforgiving territory from the civilized clamor of St. Louis to this dusty outpost squatting under the vast, indifferent Colorado sky, Redemption Creek. The name was a cruel irony. There would be no redemption for her here. She stood on the splintered planks of the station platform, the hem of her best grey travelling dress already collecting a film of ochre dust. The other passengers had disembarked with purpose melting into the embrace of waiting families or the anonymous bustle of the town's single dusty street. But Evelyn remained a solitary statue of disappointment. Her intended Mr. Bartholomew Harrison had been there to meet her. He was a man whose letters had been filled with polite, if sterile prose, promising a comfortable home and respectable companionship. The photograph he'd sent showed a stern but handsome man in his late 30s, his eyes holding a look of fierce ambition. The man in person was all that and more. He was taller than his picture suggested, broader in the shoulder, and his eyes, a startlingly pale blue, held not ambition, but a chilling sort of appraisal. They swept over her, from the sensible bonnet tied beneath her chin to the tips of her worn but polished boots, and a flicker of something disdain perhaps crossed his features. He had not even offered her a hand down from the carriage. He'd simply stood there, his hands in the pockets of a finely tailored waistcoat, a gold watch chain glinting in the aggressive afternoon sun. Miss Reed, he'd stated the words clipped and final. I find you unsuitable. Unsuitable. The word hung in the air between them, more brutal than any profanity. He hadn't elaborated. He didn't need to. He'd turned on his heel, motioned to a man holding the reins of a fine pair of chestnuts hitched to a buckboard, and said loud enough for the station master and a half-dozen onlookers to hear pay the lady's return fare. She is not what was advertised. Humiliation was a physical thing. It was a hot flush that crawled up her neck, a tightening in her chest that made it hard to breathe. The whispers of the townsfolk were like the buzzing of horseflies, persistent and irritating. She had spent the last of her meager savings on the journey, on the dress, on the hope of a new life, far from the suffocating poverty and loneliness of her past. She was an orphan, raised in a cold institution where suitability was measured in meekness and obedience. She thought she had perfected both. Clearly, she had failed. Now, hours later, the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. The return train wasn't due for 2 days. The station master, a kindly but harried man named Jebediah, had let her sit on the bench inside the small ticket office until he had to lock up. Now she was outside again, the evening chill seeping into her bones. Her small trunk sat beside her, a solitary monument to her failed enterprise. Redemption. Creek offered one hotel, and its proprietor had taken one look at her, a single woman publicly spurned by the town's wealthiest rancher, and declared he had no vacancies. She had nowhere to go. The lonesome whistle blew again as a freight train, not a passenger line, slowly rumbled past its cars, clattering a rhythm of defeat. Evelyn stared at the moving wheels, a dark, fleeting thought tempting her. It would be so easy. A single step. An end to the shame, the fear, the crushing weight of being utterly, terrifyingly alone. She closed her eyes, fighting the pull of that dark abyss. She had survived the orphanage. She had survived the typhoid outbreak that had claimed her only friend. She would survive this. But how? A sound small and out of place cut through the clatter of the train. It wasn't a coyote's howl or the wind. It was a sniffle. Evelyn's eyes snapped open. She scanned the deepening gloom around the station. Nothing. Then she saw it. A small shape huddled between two stacks of railroad ties, a little way down the track, perilously close to the slow-moving freight cars. It was a child, a little boy no older than 5 or 6, his small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Forgetting her own misery, Evelyn was on her feet in an instant. Her heart hammered against her ribs for an entirely new reason. "Child," she called out, her voice tight with alarm. "Get away from there." She hurried down the gravel verge, her skirts catching on brambles. The boy didn't seem to hear her over the noise of the train. He was wearing dusty overalls and a worn shirt, his hair a mess of blonde curls. He was staring at the passing train cars as if mesmerized. Evelyn reached him just as the last car, the caboose rattled by its red lanterns, winking like malevolent eyes into the twilight. She knelt her hand, landing gently on his small, trembling back. "Are you all right?" "Where are your folks?" The boy flinched at her touch and looked up. His face was streaked with dirt and tears, but it was his eyes that arrested her. They were the same startlingly pale blue as Bartholomew Harrison's. A wave of nausea rolled through her. This could not be a coincidence. The boy stared at her, his gaze wet and searching. He looked at her face, her bonnet, her grey dress. His sobbing subsided, replaced by a look of desperate, fragile hope. His small, chapped lips parted. "Are you my mummy?" He whispered, his voice a reedy plea that seemed to silence the whole world. The question struck Evelyn with the force of a physical blow. It was so raw, so full of a pain that dwarfed her own. She felt her carefully constructed composure shatter into 1,000 pieces. "Mummy," a word she herself had never been able to say with any meaning. All the loneliness of her own childhood welled up inside her, a tidal wave of empathy for this tiny, lost soul. She could have said no. A simple, honest, and heartbreaking no. She could have said, "I don't know, child, who is your mother." But something stopped her. Around his neck, on a thin leather cord, hung a small object that glinted in the last rays of sunlight. It was a silver locket, tarnished and dented, but unmistakably familiar. Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart stopped. It was identical to the one she wore tucked beneath the collar of her dress. The one her own mother had given her before she died, a matching locket to the one she had given Evelyn's older sister Martha, who had run away from the orphanage years ago and vanished without a trace. Evelyn's mind reeled. The boy. Harrison. The locket. It was an impossible convergence of fates. Her own quest. The secret reason she'd answered the advertisement of a man from a town she'd never heard of was suddenly staring her in the face. She hadn't come here just for security. She had come here following the faintest of rumors, that a woman matching Martha's description had been seen in this part of the country. She had gambled everything on a long shot, a whisper. The boy was still looking at her, waiting for an answer, his blue eyes brimming with unshed tears. Evelyn swallowed her throat dry as dust. She reached up and slowly, with a trembling hand, unclasped the locket from her own neck. She held it out in her palm, next to the one the boy wore. They were perfect twins. Her voice, when it came, was a raw whisper, a sound that carried the weight of years of searching, of a sudden terrifying revelation. Her reply stole the very breath from the boy's lungs and hung shimmering with impossible meaning in the cold night air. "No, little one," she said, her eyes locking with his. "But I think I'm your aunt." The boy's gasp was sharp, a tiny intake of air that was more confusion than relief. He stared at the two identical lockets in Evelyn's palm, then back up at her face. The word aunt was foreign, a concept he couldn't immediately grasp. His world had been reduced to the simple aching binary of mummy and not mummy. Aunt, he repeated the word clumsy on his tongue. "Your mother, is she my sister?" Evelyn pressed gently, her mind racing, trying to assemble the jagged pieces of the puzzle. "Her name is Martha. Does she have hair the color of corn silk? Does she sing when she hangs the laundry?" The boy's face crumpled again, a fresh wave of grief washing over him. "Mummy's gone," he hiccuped. "Papa said she went away. He said she didn't want us no more. Papa." Bartholomew Harrison. The man who had called Evelyn unsuitable. The man whose cruelty was a fresh, stinging wound. The thought that he could be married to her long-lost sister and have treated her with such callousness sent a chill of pure dread down Evelyn's spine. "What is your name, child?" she asked, her tone softening. "Thomas," he mumbled, wiping his nose on the sleeve of his overall. "But Mummy calls me Tom." "Tom," Evelyn repeated. The name felt solid real. "Well, Tom, we can't stay here." The immediate problem of survival eclipsed the swirling mystery. The night was growing colder, and a lone wolf's howl sliced through the darkness from the distant hills. She was a penniless, rejected woman, with the missing son of the most powerful man in the territory. It was a dangerous, untenable position. She took Tom's small, cold hand in hers. "Come with me. We need to find somewhere warm." Her trunk was too heavy to carry far. She grabbed her smaller reticule, which held her locket, the few dollars, meant for her return ticket, and a photograph of her and Martha as girls. Leaving the trunk by the station wall was a risk, but Tom was the priority. She led him away from the tracks and toward the faint lights of the town. Her mind, once numb with despair, was now razor-sharp. Her own plight had been replaced by a fierce protective instinct. This boy, her nephew, was the only link she had to her sister. She would not let him go. Her first thought was the church. Its white steeple was a pale finger pointing at the star-dusted sky. A man of God would surely help a woman and child in need. The church was dark, its doors locked. Her next stop was the doctor's office, a small clapboard house with a light burning in the window. She knocked her knuckles, rapping a hesitant rhythm. The door was opened by a woman with tired eyes and flour on her apron. "Yes, I'm sorry to bother you so late, ma'am. My nephew and I are in need of assistance. The boy is lost and I—" The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, taking in Evelyn's dusty but well-made dress and Tom's disheveled state. "You're the one." The mail-order bride, Harrison, sent packing. The news had already travelled. Of course it had. And this is his boy. He's been missing since this afternoon. Evelyn's heart sank. Yes. I found him by the tracks. The woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Gable, the doctor's wife, was not unkind, but she was wary. The shadow of Bartholomew Harrison loomed large over Redemption Creek. I can't keep you here, she said, her voice low. My husband does business with Mr. Harrison. It would be unwise. But you can't stay on the street. She paused, chewing her lip. Go to the Widow Douglas's boarding house. It's the last house on the street, the one with the blue door. Tell her I sent you. She doesn't scare easy. Not since her husband was killed in the mining dispute. Evelyn thanked her profusely, and clutching Tom's hand tighter, made her way to the end of the street. The Widow Douglas was a stern, raw-boned woman with iron-grey hair pulled into a severe bun. She listened to Evelyn's story, her face impassive. She looked down at Tom, who was hiding behind Evelyn's skirts, and her expression softened almost imperceptibly. One night, the widow said, her voice raspy, I've got a small room in the back. Price is $2, in advance. Evelyn handed over the last of her money. It was a foolish gamble, leaving her with nothing but the promise of a bed and a locked door was worth everything. The room was small and spare, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair. But it was clean, and to Evelyn it felt like a palace. While Tom, exhausted, fell asleep almost instantly, Evelyn sat on the chair, the photograph of her and Martha in her hands. The mystery consumed her. Why would Harrison send for a mail-order bride if he was already married to her sister? And why would he claim Martha had abandoned him and her son? It didn't make sense. The Martha she remembered was fiercely loyal. A girl who had once fought off a much larger boy in the orphanage for stealing Evelyn's bread ration. She would never abandon her child. The knock on the door came just after dawn. It was firm official. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She opened the door to find a tall man wearing a silver star on his vest. He had a weathered face, a drooping moustache, and eyes that had seen too much. Ma'am, he said, his voice a low drawl. I'm Sheriff Brody. I believe you have something that belongs to Mr. Harrison. Evelyn's heart hammered. She glanced back at Tom, who was still sleeping soundly. I have a little boy here, Sheriff. I found him lost and alone by the railroad. His name is Tom. I know his name, Sheriff Brody said, his gaze steady. Bartholomew Harrison has the whole county out looking for him. He's not a man who likes his property to go missing. The word property grated on Evelyn. He is not a piece of property. He is a child, his son. That he is the sheriff agreed, though his eyes held a flicker of something unreadable. Mr. Harrison wants him back, and he wants to know why his intended bride, who he sent away, has absconded with him. This was it. The moment of truth. She could play the meek, confused woman, or she could take a stand. She thought of Tom's tear-streaked face, of her missing sister, of the cold dismissal on the station platform. Meekness had gotten her nowhere. Sheriff, she said, her voice clear and firm. I did not abscond with him. I rescued him, and I have reason to believe this boy is my nephew. She stepped back, allowing the sheriff to enter the small room. She showed him the 2 lockets. Then she pulled out the worn photograph. This is my sister Martha Reed and me 10 years ago. I believe she is, or was, married to Mr. Harrison, and I believe she is in terrible trouble. Sheriff Brody studied the photograph, his brow furrowed. He looked from the picture to the sleeping boy. The resemblance between the young Martha and Tom was faint but present in the shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw. Harrison's wife was named Martha, he said slowly, his voice dropping. She disappeared. About 6 months back. Harrison put it about that she was unstable, that her nerves were shot. Said she just up and ran off one night. I don't believe it, Evelyn stated flatly. My sister was not unstable. The sheriff was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. He had been sheriff here for 20 years. He knew the secrets the dust tried to cover. Mr. Harrison is a powerful man, Miss Reed. He owns the Double H Ranch, which is half the county. He controls the water rights. People in this town depend on him for their livelihoods. Accusing him of something, it's a dangerous game. I'm not accusing him of anything yet, Sheriff Evelyn replied, her chin held high. I am simply trying to find my sister and protect her son. Tom told me his father said his mother didn't want him anymore. What kind of man tells a 5-year-old boy that Sheriff Brody's gaze met hers? And for the first time, Evelyn saw a glimmer of alliance. He was a lawman, but he was also a man who understood the difference between what was legal and what was right. All right, Miss Reed, he said, letting out a long sigh. I'll tell Harrison his boy is safe and sound. I'll tell him you found him and are looking after him at the boarding house. But I can't hold him off forever. He will come for the boy. And when he does, you'd best be ready. He tipped his hat and left. Evelyn locked the door, her heart still pounding. The fragile alliance was formed. It was her, a penniless woman, and a world-weary sheriff against the most powerful man in the region. And in the bed, the cause of it all, her nephew slept on, unaware that his small, whispered question on the railroad tracks had just ignited a fever. The arrival of Bartholomew Harrison was not an event, it was an invasion. It came 2 hours after the sheriff's departure, not as a knock, but as a shadow that fell across the window of the small room. Evelyn looked out to see Harrison dismounting from a magnificent black stallion that pawed impatiently at the dust. Behind him on another horse sat a lean, hard-faced man with eyes as cold and grey as river stones. This must be Finch, the man she'd seen at the station. The widow Douglas met Harrison at the front door. Evelyn couldn't hear the words, but the widow's rigid posture and Harrison's dismissive gesture told the whole story. A moment later, heavy, determined footsteps echoed down the narrow hall. They stopped outside her door. Miss Reed Harrison's voice boomed, stripped of any pretense of civility. "Open this door! You have my son!" Tom, who had been quietly eating a piece of dry bread Evelyn had procured from the widow, started to tremble. He scrambled behind Evelyn, clutching her skirt. Evelyn took a deep breath, steeling herself. She was no longer just Evelyn Reed, the failed mail-order bride. She was Tom's aunt. She was Martha's sister. She opened the door. Harrison filled the doorway, his sheer physical presence overwhelming the small space. His pale blue eyes, so like his son's, were blazing with fury. They flickered from Evelyn to the terrified boy hiding behind her. "Thomas!" "Come here," he commanded. The boy only burrowed deeper into the folds of Evelyn's dress. The sight of his son cowering from him only seemed to enrage Harrison further. His gaze snapped back to Evelyn. "What game are you playing, woman? You were dismissed. Your business in this town is concluded. To then take my son is an act of kidnapping. I found him by the railroad tracks, Mr. Harrison. He was alone and crying." Evelyn said, her voice surprisingly steady. She would not be intimidated. He could have been killed. He is my son. His welfare is my concern, not that of a rejected transient. He spat the insult, landing like a whip crack. He is also my nephew, Evelyn countered, raising her chin. She held up her locket. And I would very much like to know where his mother, my sister, is. For the first time, a flicker of something other than rage crossed Harrison's face. It was caution, a predator reassessing its prey. He glanced at the locket, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Your sister," he scoffed, recovering quickly. "You expect me to believe this far-fetched tale? You are an opportunistic grifter, Miss Reed, nothing more. You saw a chance to extort me after your dismissal." "The locket was a gift from our mother," Evelyn said, pressing her advantage. "Martha had its twin." "The one your son is wearing?" Did she tell you that Harrison's eyes narrowed? "My wife was a troubled woman, prone to flights of fancy and melancholia. She was not well. She ran away, I told the sheriff as much. She abandoned her family. That's what you told your son." Evelyn shot back, her voice laced with accusation. "You told a 5-year-old boy his mother didn't want him. What sort of man does that?" "I am the sort of man who does not have his private family matters questioned by a meddling stranger," he thundered. The force of his voice made the small room seem to shrink. Tom let out a small whimper. Evelyn knelt, putting a protective arm around the boy. She looked up at Harrison, her fear eclipsed by a cold, burning anger. "She is my sister. That makes it my business." "Where is she, Mr. Harrison?" Harrison took a step into the room. He was close enough now that she could smell the leather from his saddle and the faint, expensive scent of bay rum. He was a lion in a cage, powerful and dangerous. "You have a choice, Miss Reed," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "You can hand over the boy, take the train ticket I so generously provided, and disappear from my town and my life. Or you can stay, and you will find that Redemption Creek has very little redemption to offer a woman who makes an enemy of me." The threat was unambiguous. He could ruin her. He could run her out of town, or worse. The man with the cold eyes, Finch, was still waiting outside, a silent promise of violence. Evelyn looked down at Tom's blonde curls, his small hand gripping her arm with desperate strength. She thought of her sister Martha, who Harrison described as unstable. She thought of the fear she must have felt to leave her child behind. If Evelyn left now, who would speak for Martha? Who would protect this boy from a father who saw him as property and his mother as an inconvenience? She had nothing left to lose. She had already been rejected, shamed, left penniless. All she had was this newfound connection, this sliver of a chance to find her sister. It was everything. She rose to her full height, which was still a good foot shorter than Harrison, but she met his furious gaze without flinching. "The boy stays with me," she declared, her voice ringing with a conviction she didn't know she possessed. "Until I am satisfied with the answers about what happened to my sister." Harrison stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief that slowly hardened into pure, cold fury. He looked as if he wanted to strike her, to physically wrench the boy from her grasp. But something held him back. The sheriff's visit had lent her a thin veil of legitimacy. Creating a public scene harming a woman in a boarding house with his son as a witness was perhaps a line even he would not cross. Yet. "You will regret this," he hissed, each word a poisoned dart. "You have no idea the mistake you have just made." He turned on his heel, his boots striking the wooden floor like hammer blows, and strode out of the room. The air he left behind felt thick and dangerous. Evelyn rushed to the door and bolted it, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. She had stood her ground. She had faced the lion in his den and had not been devoured. But as she leaned against the door, her heart thudding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, she knew this was only the beginning. She had won the battle, but Bartholomew Harrison had just declared war. And in that war, she was terribly, terrifyingly outgunned. The days following the confrontation with Harrison were a tense, suffocating quiet. Evelyn and Tom were prisoners in their small room, subsisting on the meager meals the widow Douglas would leave outside their door. The widow, though she never said it, was clearly terrified. Her other boarders, rough-looking miners and ranch hands, gave Evelyn's door a wide berth, their sidelong glances a mixture of pity and fear. To be in Evelyn's orbit was to be in Harrison's shadow, and no one wanted that. Evelyn knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. Harrison was patient, a predator, waiting for its prey to make a mistake. Her only ally was Sheriff Brody, and she needed to see him. Leaving Tom in the care of the reluctant widow for a half-hour with strict instructions to keep the door bolted, Evelyn slipped out the back of the boarding house at dusk. She moved through the alleyways, her heart pounding at every shadow, every stray dog's bark. The town felt different now. The ordinary bustle of life seemed to have a sinister undercurrent. She could feel eyes on her from curtained windows and saloon doorways. She found Sheriff Brody in his office, a cramped space that smelled of stale coffee and sawdust. He was hunched over a stack of paperwork, the light from a kerosene lamp casting long shadows across his weary face. "Miss Reed," he said, looking up, not entirely surprised to see her. "I'd say you were taking a risk coming here, but staying in that room is probably just as dangerous. I can't just wait for him to make his move," Sheriff Evelyn said, her voice a hushed, urgent whisper. "He's lying. I know he is. Martha would never have just run away." "Proving it's another matter." Brody sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Harrison's story is the only one this town has. He told everyone his wife's mind was fragile. People are inclined to believe a man about his own wife, especially when that man signs their paychecks. But there must be someone who knew her." Evelyn insisted. "A friend. A doctor." The sheriff's eyes sharpened. Doc Gable's wife, Helen, helped deliver the boy. She and Martha were friendly. As friendly as Harrison allowed anyone to be with his wife. Mrs. Gable, the woman who had first directed her to the widow's house, the woman whose husband did business with Harrison. It was a risk, but one she had to take. "What about the land?" Evelyn asked, recalling something the widow had muttered about a mining dispute. Mrs. Douglas mentioned her husband died in one. Brody's expression darkened. Harrison didn't own the Double H when he first came here. It belonged to an old prospector named Angus Reed. Evelyn's breath hitched. "Reed. The same as my name. Just a coincidence of the West." "I suppose," the sheriff said, though he looked thoughtful. "Angus was Martha's father. He struck a rich silver vein on the property. Not long after Harrison showed up. Charming, full of promises. He courted Martha, married her, quick as you please. A few months after the wedding, old Angus had a hunting accident. Fell into a ravine. Harrison, as his son-in-law, and Martha's husband, inherited everything. The ranch, the water rights, the silver mine. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. This wasn't a story about a troubled wife. This was about greed. Vicious, all-consuming greed. Harrison hadn't married Martha for love. He'd married her for her father's land. And if Martha started to suspect something wasn't right with her father's death, Evelyn posited her voice, barely a whisper. If she found something learned, something, she wouldn't be a troubled wife. She'd be a threat. Sheriff Brody nodded slowly, his gaze grave. She would be a liability, one he would need to manage. A cold dread settled deep in Evelyn's bones. This was worse than she had imagined. She wasn't just looking for a missing person. She was walking into the middle of a conspiracy that likely involved murder. As she left the sheriff's office, the feeling of being watched intensified. This time it wasn't just paranoia. Under the dim light of a street lamp, she saw him. Finch, Harrison's shadow. He was leaning against the wall of the general store, whittling a piece of wood with a long, sharp knife. He wasn't trying to hide. He was sending a message. "We see you. We know what you're doing." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She quickened her pace, her gaze fixed on the ground in front of her, not daring to look at him again. The walk back to the boarding house felt like a mile. The next morning, she risked another outing, this time to the doctor's house with Tom in tow. She needed the boy with her. Leaving him alone felt too dangerous now. She found Mrs. Gable hanging laundry in her backyard, her movements brisk and nervous. "Miss Reed." "You shouldn't be here, Helen," Gable said immediately, not meeting her eyes. "Mrs. Gable, please," Evelyn pleaded. "I know you were friends with my sister. I'm not asking you to stand against Mr. Harrison. I just need to know the truth." Was she unstable? Helen Gable glanced nervously toward her own house, then at the fences of her neighbors. She lowered her voice to a whisper. Unstable. No. She was terrified. That man. He controlled every aspect of her life. Who she spoke to, where she went. After Tom was born, it got worse. She was a prisoner in her own home. She wrung a wet sheet in her hands, her knuckles white. She told me once she was afraid. Not for herself, but for Tom. She said Harrison didn't love the boy, he saw him as an heir. A continuation of his own name on the land he stole. Stole? Evelyn prompted gently. She never said it outright, but she suspected her father's death was no accident. She was looking for proof. A ledger, a letter, anything. Helen's eyes filled with tears. The week before she disappeared, she came to me. She was pale as a ghost. She said she'd found something. She didn't say what. She just said, "He knows I know." She was making a plan to run to take Tom with her. But she didn't take him. Evelyn said, the painful question hanging in the air. She must not have been able to. Helen sobbed quietly. He must have stopped her. Oh Lord, what did he do to that poor girl? A floorboard creaked on the back porch of the house. Both women froze. Dr. Gable stood there, his face ashen. "Helen, get inside, now!" His eyes darted past Evelyn, looking at the street beyond. "You need to leave Miss Reed, immediately." His panic was infectious. Evelyn grabbed Tom's hand and hurried away, her mind reeling from the confirmation of her worst fears. Martha hadn't run away. She had been silenced. As she rounded the corner onto the main street, a horse thundered past, kicking up a cloud of dust. It was Finch. He reined the horse in sharply in front of them, blocking their path. He didn't speak. He just stared down at them from the saddle, his cold eyes promising violence. Then he deliberately spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, just inches from Evelyn's feet. The message was clearer than any words. The warnings were over. The blatant intimidation from Finch was a turning point. The fragile safety of the boarding house had evaporated. Harrison was done waiting. Evelyn knew they had to run. But where could they go? They had no money, no allies willing to openly defy Harrison. And his men were watching their every move. The answer came from Tom. That evening, as Evelyn tried to coax him into eating a little broth, he was quieter than usual. He kept tracing patterns on the dusty floor with his finger. "What are you thinking about, sweet boy?" Evelyn asked softly. "Mummy's secret place." He mumbled, his voice small. "She told me." She said, "Tom, if you're ever scared and I'm not there, you go to the sleepy tree and wait for me." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. The sleepy tree. What is that? "Tom, where is it?" "It's by the old shack," he said, looking up at her, his pale blue eyes earnest. "Where the cows used to sleep. It's broken now. The wind whistles through it." He pointed vaguely out the window to the west, toward the vast expanse of the Double H Ranch. "Papa doesn't go there. He says it's full of ghosts. An abandoned line shack, a place Harrison avoided. It was a long shot, a child's fragmented memory, but it was the only hope they had. Martha, knowing she was in danger, would have created a contingency plan. A place to meet, a place to hide something. They had to go that night. Waiting until the moon was hidden behind a thick bank of clouds, Evelyn scribbled a hasty note to Sheriff Brody, telling him where they were going, and pushed it under the widow's door, praying the old woman would have the courage to deliver it. Then, bundling a sleeping Tom in a threadbare blanket, she slipped out the back of the boarding house one last time. The journey was a nightmare. The Double H was miles out of town, a dark, rolling landscape of hills and arroyos. Every rustle in the sagebrush sounded like Finch's footsteps, every coyote howl like a signal. Evelyn's city-bred muscles screamed in protest, but she pushed on, driven by a desperate hope. Tom was a heavy, warm weight in her arms, his soft breaths a constant reminder of what was at stake. After what felt like an eternity, Tom stirred. There he whispered, pointing with a small hand. Ahead of them, silhouetted against the faintly lightening sky, was a skeletal structure. A shack, its roof caved in on one side, stood next to a gnarled, ancient cottonwood tree whose branches drooped low to the ground like weary arms. The sleepy tree. The shack was derelict, the door hanging off a single hinge. Inside it smelled of dust decay and old secrets. Moonlight streamed through the holes in the roof, illuminating a scene of abandonment. A broken table, an overturned chair, a rusty wood stove. It looked hopeless. Mummy Tom whispered into the gloom, his voice full of a heart-breaking hope. There was no answer, but the lonely whistle of the wind through the broken walls. Evelyn's shoulders slumped. She had dragged them all this way on a child's story. It was foolish. They were trapped, exposed on Harrison's land with dawn approaching. But then her eyes fell on the hearth of the old wood stove. One of the stones looked different from the others, its mortar fresher, less crumbled. Her heart began to pound. She knelt, her fingers probing the edges of the stone. It was loose. Using the leg of the broken chair as a lever, she pried it free. Behind it, nestled in the dark cavity, was a small oilskin-wrapped package. With trembling hands, Evelyn unwrapped it. Inside was a leather-bound journal. Martha's journal. She opened it, her eyes scanning the neat, familiar handwriting. The first entries were full of hope descriptions of the beautiful landscape and her handsome, attentive new husband. But the tone slowly changed. The entries grew shorter, more fearful. She wrote of Harrison's coldness, his temper, his obsession with the ranch. Then came the entry that made Evelyn's blood run cold. October 12th. I found Papa's old prospecting journal in the attic. Harrison told me it was lost. Papa wrote about the silver vein, the king's vein, he called it. But he also wrote of a new partner he'd taken on a man who offered to buy him out. Papa refused. He said the man was ruthless, that he threatened him. He never wrote the man's name, only his initial H. The last entry is dated the day before he fell. Harrison hadn't just married her for the land, he had likely murdered her father for it. Evelyn frantically flipped toward the end of the journal. The final entries were terrifying. April 5th. He knows I found the journal. I saw him coming out of the attic. The way he looked at me, it was not my husband. It was a stranger with death in his eyes. I have to run. I have to take my sweet Tom. He cannot be raised by this monster. And then the last entry scrawled in a shaky, rushed hand. April 7th. There is no time. Finch is watching the house. I cannot get away with Tom. My only chance is to go alone and send for him. I told him about the sleepy tree. My God, I hope he remembers. I will leave this record here, proof of what this man is. I cannot go east, they will look for me there. I will go north to the mission at Silver Creek. I pray I make it. Forgive me, my darling Tom. Mummy loves you. The mission at Silver Creek. A destination. A hope. Martha was alive. The relief was so overwhelming it almost buckled Evelyn's knees. She clutched the journal to her chest, tears of grief and joy streaming down her face. She had found the truth. A floorboard creaked outside. Evelyn froze her blood, turning to ice. The silhouette of a man filled the broken doorway. It was not Sheriff Brody. It was Bartholomew Harrison. And behind him stood the silent, menacing shape of Finch. I believe you have something that belongs to me, Harrison said, his voice calm, predatory. His pale eyes were fixed on the journal in her hands. I should have burned this place to the ground years ago. The air in the dilapidated shack grew thick and cold. Harrison took a step inside his boots, crunching on the debris-strewn floor. He was no longer the furious landowner from the boarding house. He was something far more terrifying, a man whose darkest secret was about to be exposed with nothing left to lose. "Give me the journal, Miss Reed," he said, his voice deceptively soft. Evelyn instinctively tightened her grip on it, pulling Tom closer behind her. "It's over, Harrison. It's all in here. About your threats to her father. About his accident." My sister knew. A flicker of annoyance crossed Harrison's face. "Your sister was a sentimental fool. She couldn't leave well enough alone. Just like you." His gaze dropped to Tom, who was peeking out from behind Evelyn's skirt, his small face a mask of terror. "Thomas, come to me. We are going home." The boy didn't move. He whimpered. "You hurt Mummy." The simple childish accusation struck Harrison like a physical blow. His face contorted in a snarl of pure rage. "She left you. She was weak, and she ran away." "She ran from you." Evelyn retorted, her voice ringing with the authority of the truth she now held. "To save her own life. And she left this so the world would know what kind of man you really are." This world. Harrison chuckled, a dark, humorless sound. Cares only about what I provided. Water jobs, silver. They will believe what I tell them to believe. And I will tell them that a hysterical woman distraught over the disappearance of her unstable sister sadly perished in a tragic fire along with my son. He glanced at Finch, who produced a can of kerosene from behind his back. The threat was chillingly real. They would burn the shack with them inside, destroying the journal and the only two witnesses who could connect Harrison to his crimes. "You won't get away with this," Evelyn whispered, her mind racing desperately for an escape. "I already have," Harrison said. "For years." He took another step, reaching for the journal. In that split second, a voice boomed from the doorway. "That's far enough." Harrison Sheriff Brody stood there, a shotgun held steady in his hands. He wasn't alone. Behind him were two deputies, their faces grim. The widow Douglas had delivered the note. Harrison froze, his eyes narrowing into slits. "Brody, this is a private family matter on my own land. I'd advise you to turn around and ride away. Your land ends where murder begins." The sheriff drawled, his aim unwavering. "I've got a sworn statement from Helen Gable about your wife's state of mind and her fears for her life. And I suspect that journal Miss Reed is holding will fill in the rest of the blanks. It was a standoff, Harrison and Finch against the law." For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the wind whistling through the broken walls. Then the world exploded into chaos. Harrison, realizing he was cornered, made a desperate move. He lunged not at the sheriff, but at Evelyn, grabbing for the journal. At the same time, Finch drew his pistol with lightning speed, firing at Brody. But Finch had underestimated the old lawman. Brody fired the shotgun a fraction of a second sooner. The blast echoed like a cannon in the confined space, and Finch was thrown backward out of the doorway, his pistol clattering to the ground. As Harrison wrestled with Evelyn for the journal, Tom, in a surge of terrified bravery, did the only thing a small boy could do. He bit down hard on the hand that was gripping his aunt's arm. Harrison roared in pain and surprise, his grip loosening for an instant. It was all the time Evelyn needed. She shoved him with all her might. Unbalanced, he stumbled backward, tripping over the overturned chair. He crashed to the floor, his head striking the corner of the iron wood stove with a sickening crack. Silence descended, absolute and deafening. The deputies rushed in, securing the scene. Sheriff Brody knelt beside Harrison, checking his pulse. He looked up at Evelyn, his face grim. "He's gone." It was over. Just like that. The reign of Bartholomew Harrison had ended in a dusty, derelict shack, brought down by a woman's love for her sister, a lawman's integrity, and a little boy's desperate courage. The aftermath was a blur for Evelyn. The sheriff took the journal as evidence. The town of Redemption Creek, waking to the news, was thrown into a state of shock and disbelief. The whispers that had followed Evelyn were now whispers about the dark secrets of their benefactor. Evelyn and Tom were no longer outcasts. The widow Douglas welcomed them into her home. Her stern face softened with respect. Helen Gable brought them a hot meal, her eyes full of tears and gratitude. But for Evelyn, the story wasn't over. Her sister was still out there. A week later, Sheriff Brody came to see her. He handed her a pouch heavy with coins. The town took up a collection, he explained, and per the legal statutes, with Harrison dead and his only heir a minor, his assets are frozen. But a portion has been released for the boy's care. It's enough. Evelyn looked at him, her heart full. "Thank you, Sheriff. For everything. You're the one to thank, Miss Reed," he said, tipping his hat. "You brought the truth to light. The West has a long memory for people like you." Her journey to Redemption Creek had started with a rejection. She had arrived as a mail-order bride seeking security and had been cast aside. But she would not be leaving as one. She would leave as a guardian, a sister on a mission, a woman who had found her own strength in the face of fear. Holding Tom's small hand, the journal of her sister safely in her bag, she stood once again on the platform of the train station. This time she was not looking at an empty future. She was looking north toward Silver Creek. The journey ahead would be long, but she was no longer alone. She had her nephew a destination and a fierce, unyielding hope. The whistle blew a cry not of mourning, but of a new beginning. And so Evelyn's story in Redemption Creek comes to a close, but her journey for family, for the final healing reunion with her sister, has just begun. The Wild West wasn't just a place of outlaws and gunfights. It was a crucible that tested the souls of ordinary people, forging them into something extraordinary. Evelyn Reed arrived broken, but she left a hero, proving that courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. What do you think awaits her in Silver Creek? Does a happy reunion with her sister Martha await, or will she find more danger and intrigue? The stories of the West are endless, and so many of them, just like this one, are buried in the dust waiting to be told. If this story of resilience, justice, and unbreakable family bonds moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales from the heart of the American West. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. Thank you for listening.